friends, it's Miss Winter here, and today I'm going to review with you our first week of our Settlements of the U.S. unit. Now it's kind of interesting actually that we're calling our unit Settlements of the U.S. because the U.S. is not the U.S. yet. In fact, we're going to backtrack just a little bit and try to think about how we even got to this piece of land that we now call the United States and what's been going on with it since we started our last unit. So who is on this land that's considered the United States first? Well, most of you are probably thinking in your head right now, the Native Americans. And you're completely right, but how did the Native Americans even get here in the first place? Well, we have this wonderful theory that historians have come up with called the land bridge theory, and there's science that backs it up too. So what I have here is a map of North America, and right here, that's actually the land that is now considered Alaska. Look how close it is to some of this land from Asia. You guys know that the Earth is a sphere, and Asia, on most maps, is on the complete opposite side of us. But once the entire world is put in its normal spherical state, Asia is pretty close to North America, and Alaska in particular. So in this theory called the land bridge theory, is that during the Ice Age, which was about 16,500 years ago, a lot of things were freezing. And that includes some of the oceans. And as the oceans were freezing, the water levels were actually lowering too. So this land that's pretty close to each other in this picture, it was actually in a state where people could cross it because it created a bridge out of land and ice. Because if you think about it, if you go to this ice skating rink with your family and friends, can you walk on the ice? Yeah, it's slippery, but you can walk on it. So there were a lot of people that were actually interested in traveling across the world, across this land bridge. And the people that were wanting to cross the land bridge were the Siberians. And the Siberians were originally from Asia, of course, because they came from the Asian areas, and they were following their food sources. Their food sources were migrating, so the people started migrating too. And once they were there, they were then the first actual people in the land that's now considered North America. But we do know from our studies that we had European explorers that eventually made it there too. And it seems like a really long time ago. Leif Erikson was one of the first European explorers that actually got here, and he got here in about 1001 AD. So right now we're in 2020, the year that will never end. But once he got here in 1001 AD, we realized that there was this whole new piece of land that we didn't expect was there before. And then by about 1492 was when Christopher Columbus made it here on his expedition. And then after that point, other explorers kept making it. And over this time period, the Native Americans started becoming exposed to different things that they never experienced before. And this is called the Columbian Exchange. I don't have that word up there, but this is the Columbian Exchange, where the Native Americans gave the Europeans new experiences, and the Europeans gave them new experiences. So you can see on this picture that it goes both ways. So there are some ideas and things, goods and diseases that came from Europe that made it all the way to North America. And along this, you can see some of the different things. Some of our diseases we'll talk about a little bit later. Livestock is really important that came over. And the Native Americans were able to share some things that they had with the Europeans as well. And it didn't just impact the Europeans. The Europeans were a little more connected with the rest of the world at the time than the Native Americans were. So it spread around the world. It spread to Africa, it spread to Asia, and a lot of their diets improved because a lot of the things that were coming from North America were healthy, nutritious foods. So it improved their diet. But the Native Americans, one thing that they especially benefited from was livestock. They started getting cows, pigs, chickens, horses. Horses made a huge impact, especially on the Plains Indians, because they were migrating so much, chasing their food source, the buffalo, that when they got those horses, it really improved their hunting tactics and made them more skillful hunters. Also, something that was brought over to North America from Europe was wheat. And wheat is now a really big, important thing that the United States creates. So that was really important that it came over. Some of the things that the New World, some of the things that the Europeans benefited from were corn, which was also called maize, M-I-Z-E, maize, and potatoes, squash. But as I mentioned, we also had some diseases that were transferred over. So the Europeans had a lot of diseases that the Native Americans had never been exposed to before. Diseases like smallpox, diphtheria, malaria, measles, and these things wiped out a lot of the Native Americans. It really decimated, I know that's a big word, but decimated, devastated their populations. And wasn't really a great introduction to the Native Americans. But let's take a second and put ourselves in the Native Americans' moccasins. See what I did there? Moccasins are a Native American shoe. So we're gonna put ourselves in their shoes. Okay, let's think about this. So you've been in this land for all this time and you've learned to trust your resources, you are comfortable, and all of a sudden somebody comes in after thousands of years, well, at least hundreds of years, and starts telling you how you should live your way of life. Okay, and if we connect this back to our guidance lesson that Miss Glenn has been doing during September, she says that there are some reactions that we often go to. We have fight, flight, or freeze. Fight, flight, or freeze. So those are some things that the Native Americans experienced. And we'll use our friendly puppets later to really illustrate fight, flight, or freeze. But there are positives and negatives to interactions between these new settlers and the Native Americans. The first real settlement in what's now known as the United States was in 1607, which was Jamestown. And a lot of our first interactions with the Native Americans were cooperation. So that exchange of ideas, like the Columbian Exchange, they were interested in getting new products, getting new ideas. They really benefited from a lot of the things that came over. And a lot of the original settlers had good mindset. They came over for religious freedom, and that didn't necessarily mean that they were looking for anything in particular. But over time, a lot of our interactions with the Native Americans and settlers turned into conflict. And that's because greed started taking hold. Just like in our read aloud, The Crane Wife, how our character Osamu started getting greedy over time, even though he had good intentions to start with. The settlers started also really starting to get greedy, especially in the South. They wanted to build cash crops, these crops that they could make money off of and sell. When they wanted to make these cash crops, well, they needed land, so they wanted to push the Native Americans out without paying for it. And they also needed a way to be able to get those crops. We didn't have all the same machines that we have today, so we didn't have lawnmowers and tillers and all sorts of things. So they also wanted to use the Native Americans as a labor force. But do you think they were going to pay the Native Americans to be their labor force? No. They wanted to take them as slaves. So a lot of the Native Americans were losing their land and being treated as slaves. Some people were greedy just for their own monarch. They wanted the land for their ruler in Europe, and that's one of the things that started King Philip's War. So over time, also there were religious Puritans. If you think of the word Puritans, you hear the word pure in it. They were trying to find this really religious, pure way of life and wanted to convert these Native Americans that didn't live their life to the same lifestyle as the Puritans, and they wanted to train them up in their own religion and change their lifestyle so that they could also celebrate the same religion. So they built prayer towns, which were reservations that were very religious. So they were changing their way of life. They were bringing diseases. They were taking land and taking lives. So the European settlers really, for the most part, negatively impacted the Native Americans. Now, there are always exceptions. Not every single settler was going to have negative interactions with the Native Americans, and not all of the Native Americans are going to have negative or positive experiences with the European settlers, because if we think about it, we're all different. We're all different people, and we react different ways. Just the other day, I was asking my class how they would react if they were the Native Americans, and that's when we landed on the fight, flight, or freeze situation that we're going to use our puppets for. So, all right, let's make the Europeans cats, and the Native Americans is going to be this dog. These are our friends from our Big Ideas math unit. You might have seen them in your math book, but we have these puppets in the back, so I decided to use them. I decided to use the dog for Native American because I felt like in many regards the European settlers would treat the Native Americans like they were dogs or garbage or not really humans. That's part of the problem, is that they didn't see them as equals. They didn't see them as equals because they didn't have the same kind of wealth, and they didn't have the same kind of lifestyle as the Europeans were used to having. And because they were living in a more technologically advanced civilization, they looked down on the Native Americans. Okay, so we've got our European settlers, and we have our Native Americans. So Native Americans are right here. European settlers come along and say, boom, this is mine now, okay? What are the Native Americans gonna do? Okay, some people in some situations, they're just gonna say, no, this is my spot. They're gonna stand their ground, they're gonna freeze. And some of the Native Americans did that. They did that respectfully. Nope, this is mine, I've got this, okay? Another type of reaction that could have happened is that the Native Americans would say, okay, this is uncomfortable, I'll just leave. And so they would leave on their own. So that would be like a flight. You don't want to have anything to do with this, so you're just going to walk away. But another reaction could be to fight. So somebody comes at you, you go back into it. Now, all of those are different types of reactions, and they're all natural types of reactions. But we just needed to talk about them today and think about our interactions between the settlers and the Native Americans. Thank you guys. I'll see you next week.